For now, let's say we're in cruise and we've lost an engine. Well, the first thing we're going to do is take a deep breath because the plane's going to keep flying. The worst thing you can do in an engine failure is react too quickly and shut down the wrong engine. So we're gonna take a moment here and we're gonna analyze the situation. Now, knowing that you have a dead engine is kind of difficult in a light twin.
That's Seth Lake talking about why it's difficult to handle an engine failure when flying a multi-engine aircraft. In a moment, we'll be talking with him about what you need to know to get a multi-engine rating, and if you already have a rating, what you need to remember to continue to fly light twins safely. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. By the way, if you have any interest at all in buying a Cirrus SR-20, SR-22, or SF-50 Vision Jet, or you'd like flight training in one, I talk with several listeners every week who call me for advice on next steps or sometimes about the trade-offs of buying new versus used aircraft. There's a lot I can help you with, so please call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 120, we talked about troubleshooting radio and audio panel problems, so if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you found value in any of our shows, well, please support us with just a small donation through our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Or if you have a PayPal account, please make a one-time or monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, we'll read your name on the show. Now here's our conversation with Seth Lake. Now let me tell you a little bit about Seth Lake. Seth is an Air Force Reserve C-130 instructor pilot, recently out of active duty. He's now a full-time flight instructor and DPE, giving check rides in Arkansas. His business, VSL Aviation, operates a beach travel air, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in that aircraft. Seth, welcome to the show. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thanks, Max. It is really great to be here.
Well, so multi-engine, it's kind of interesting. I think that's probably changed a little bit over the years. When I think back 20, 30 years ago, everybody was getting multi-engine. Now, not everybody does. Talk about what's changed and why, some people don't feel like they need to get multi-engine anymore.
Yeah, it has definitely changed, and you can tell that by the number of light twins that are on the market currently. You can probably name them off on, one or two hands. There's not that many. The Beechcraft Travel Air that I operate was built in 1959, and in that time frame, it was kind of the first of the light twin, or the beginning of the light twin market. When the Travel Air was being produced, you had almost every major company was producing some sort of twin engine aircraft, and it was very popular. It was seen as safer and faster, and you could haul more cargo and higher useful weight. And I think what's changed recently is as technology's progressed, specifically with different types of material, the light twins have gotten, or the singles that is, have gotten more aerodynamic. The engines have gotten more powerful, and you're seeing now an SR-22 has basically the same useful load as my Travel Air, or a lot of Barons, in fact, and is maybe slightly slower, but you're talking 5 to 10 knots maybe, so that's saving you 10 or 15 minutes on your trip, but a Cirrus is only burning 14 gallons an hour versus a Beechcraft Baron. You'll typically see about 35 gallons an hour. So it's just the fact that light twins are not that cheap to operate, and they're not that cheap to own, and you're really not gaining a lot of capability over some of the more advanced singles that are available.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess the other thing is gas price has gone quite a little bit. And so what I see is, people who are doing personal flying, they're not doing as much of that in multi-engines as they would have done many years ago. But let's talk about the people who are doing it. Who do you see coming out to get multi-engine ratings these days, and why are they doing that?
Yeah, probably every flight instructor sees different types of clients. I could probably categorize mine into 3 separate groups. The first group being clients that are buying a multi-engine aircraft. There are people out there buying them. You can actually find multi-engine aircraft, or light twins specifically, pretty cheaply now because they're not in as high demand. So folks can go out, they can purchase a Baron for about the same price as you could purchase a used Cirrus, and the economics of it, they decide makes sense for them, and they need to learn how to fly it. So I'll have those clients with their own equipment want to get their multi-engine add-on. The other major group that I see are people that are looking to start their career in aviation, and they've already gotten their single-engine commercial and instrument rating, and kind of the next step is their multi-engine add-on rating. A lot of the professional aviation jobs involve multi-engine aircraft, so that makes the multi-engine rating the last step before you start your career as a professional aviator, typically. Lastly, and this is a smaller group that I feel is probably unique to what I see, is I serve a lot of military veterans that are looking to get their ATP rating. So they already have a multi-engine rating, but they're going out and getting their ATP, and they're self-sponsoring that. And what I mean by that is, if you're familiar at all with the airline world right now, you are probably aware of the pilot shortage, and you're probably aware that regional airlines will gladly pay for your ATP training if you meet all the minimum hour requirements. However, the military veterans, specifically fixed-wing pilots with over the ATP minimums, can pretty easily get a job with a major airline. In order to do that, though, you need to have your ATP completed already. So they self-sponsor the ATP CTP program, and then they need to find a place to get their ATP practical done. So that's where they'll find a small flight school like myself, pay for 8 hours or so in my cheap to operate light twin, and then go take the ATP practical so they can get a application in with a major airline. So those are kind of the three groups that I see is, people who purchase the aircraft that need to learn how to fly it, those that are looking into moving, their first real job in professional aviation, and military veterans getting their ATP practical.
For sure. I see a lot of folks who are professional, career-oriented, who want to get their the multi-engine. For people who are trying to get to the airlines and they're trying to get their ratings in the most efficient way, at what stage does it make sense to get the multi-engine rating? Before or after you get your commercial?
So the typical way that I encourage my clients to go about their multi-engine rating is, you, of course, need to get your private single engine done. That's everybody's first step. Then move on to the instrument rating, then the single engine commercial, and then do the multi-engine commercial. Now, there are schools out there, I believe, I won't name them on here, but I know there are some major Part 61 flight schools that do the commercial rating in the twin, in a light twin. So your first commercial check ride will be in a light twin. That is pretty expensive way to go about it, because if you look at Part 61, you have to do the entire commercial check ride in a multi-engine aircraft. So mastering all those maneuvers, like the Chandelle and Lazy Eights and eights-on pylons, you have to do all of that in a twin-engine aircraft. So that can really increase the cost drastically of your commercial rating. If you find a cheaper to operate single, get your commercial done, then all you have to do for a multi-engine add-on is the areas outlined in the appendix of the Airman Certification Standards, and there's a table in the back of the ACS, in the commercial ACS, called the Additional Task Table. So if you look at that, there's really just a handful of items that you have to do in a multi-engine aircraft to add on that commercial rating. So typically my clients can get their commercial add-on in a multi for less than $4,000.
I think that's probably the thing that surprises people who've spent a lot of time and a lot of money getting their private, and then many hours to get their instrument rating. I mean, the commercial's surprisingly easy to get from kind of a time standpoint. Talk a little bit about what are the requirements for getting a multi-engine rating.
To get this add-on rating, if you look at FAR 6163C, just if anybody wants to read in their hymnals of where I'm pulling this information from, 6163C basically just says if you're adding on to a class, so you already hold a single-engine commercial rating and you're just adding on a multi-engine, you don't have to meet all the requirements outlined in Part 61 for the commercial rating, because you've already met those. So really, the minimum hours you need are the 3 hours from a CFI to take the practical test. Now, you're going to need more than 3 hours to master the particular maneuvers in the multi-engine check ride. And typically I see about 7 hours is adequate to master the maneuvers that you need to show proficiency in during the commercial multi-engine check ride. So that really decreases the amount of hours people think. If you read Part 61, it kind of looks like at first glance that you need 20 or 25 hours and cross-country, all that. Well, as long as you hold a single-engine commercial rating, you don't have to meet those. Now, on the check ride itself, we're going to cover, ironically, mainly flying the plane with one engine. So most of your multi-engine training will focus around on flying a multi-engine airplane with one engine. That's because that's the crux of flying a multi-engine aircraft, is losing the critical engine. And we can go into what all that means specifically. But as far as the maneuvers go, well, a brief description of the check ride is a short field takeoff, climb up to the area, do slow flight, power on stalls, power off stalls, an emergency descent, a engine shutdown, an engine restart, and something that's called the VMCA demo. Then we descend back down, shoot a precision approach. Normally I like to do an ILS single engine to a full stop. Then we take off again. We have an engine failure on takeoff, and that's before that happens at a really low speed. So don't think, if you've heard the airline guys use the term a V1 cut, it's nothing near that. It's a pretty low speed engine failure, and that's simulated. Then we go back, take off again, and at 400 feet or above, you'll have another simulated engine failure, and then a short field landing, and you're done. So that check ride typically takes about an hour to an hour and a half.
Well, and I did my ATP in the old Travel Air, and I'm just thinking right now that my legs feel sore. It's a lot of pressure for rudder pressure, isn't it, when you're single engine?
Yeah, I believe the number is 150 pounds of rudder force. It has to be 150 pounds or less to certify for VMC, which is the min control speed for a multi-engine aircraft. I don't believe that's the right number, and you can find that in Part 23.
So you've mentioned a whole lot of interesting terms here. Let's start with critical engine. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, so the critical engine on most U.S. airplanes that don't have counter-rotating props is going to be the left engine, and that's the aircraft left engine. So the reason for this is all the left-turning tendencies you learn about in single-engine flying, they apply to a multi-engine aircraft. But more importantly, it's the P factor, which, if you remember back to your probably private pilot training days, the downward descending blade is creating more thrust than the upward or ascending blade. So if you think about the prop disc and the thrust coming from the right side of both props, well, the right side of the left prop is much closer to the aircraft's center of gravity than the right side of the right prop, which is further away. It has a longer arm. So when you lose the thrust from the left engine, the right engine now has that bigger moment arm that it's pulling, yawing the aircraft around its center of gravity axis. So the critical engine is the left engine because the right engine has worse handling characteristics when it's the only engine operating. So that's why we call the left engine the critical engine.
And that's the one that always seems to get failed in training.
Yeah, I like to fail both the left and right engines, and we will do that in my training. But particularly for the VMC demo, you have to fail the left engine. I do like failing both, though, and you can definitely tell a difference when you fail the right engine. Things are a little bit easier to handle. There's less rudder force being applied, and the plane can typically climb slightly better with a right engine failure versus a left engine failure.
And let's talk through just what one does with an engine failure. What are the different steps, and what type of difference is there in attitude of the aircraft when you're flying with just one engine?
Yeah, so flying with one engine, first let's talk about VMCA. That's a term that I've used a couple of times. VMCA is your minimum control speed in the air, so that's where the A is coming from. You also, in larger transport category aircraft, you'll have a VMCG, which is a min control speed on the ground. But VMCA uses a specific criteria. So the operating engine is the or the dead engine, that is the critical engine. The operating engine is at full power. The gear's up. The flaps are in the takeoff position. You have the most unfavorable weight and most unfavorable CG. You have 2 to 5 degrees of bank into the operating engine, and you have 0 side slip, which I normally characterize as you're splitting the ball. You don't have the ball centered, but you're splitting the ball on your turn coordinator. And so now you've met all the requirements for VMCA, and you're going to climb at a new airspeed to single engine pilots, which is called VYSE, and that's best rate single engine. You can also refer to this as blue line. But blue line is kind of the end-all be-all speed for a light twin. Once you know the blue line, that's where you go pretty much no matter what. You're going to climb out at blue line. If you lose an engine, you're going to blue line. If you need to clear an obstacle, you're going to do so at blue line. So flying at blue line with a failed engine is kind of your safest configuration going away from the ground. So now that we know what VMCA is, let's go back for a second and talk about what are our critical steps when we experience an engine failure. And we're going to handle an engine failure differently depending on where we're at in the flight phase that we're in, and we can talk about that here in a moment. But for now, let's say we're in cruise and we've lost an engine. Well, the first thing we're going to do is take a deep breath, because the plane's going to keep flying. The worst thing you can do in an engine failure is react too quickly and shut down the wrong engine. So we're gonna take a moment here and we're gonna analyze the situation. Now, knowing that you have a dead engine is kind of difficult in a light twin. What I like to do in my training to demonstrate this is when we get to altitude, I will usually in the process of doing a clearing turn, I'll make sure my student's looking out the left side of the window. I'll reach down and I'll turn off a fuel selector. Now, I don't recommend this to anyone that doesn't have a lot of multi-engine instructor time, and I only do this at very safe altitudes, above 5,000 AGL specifically. So the student is unaware that I've turned off the fuel. It takes about 30 seconds in the travel air for that fuel, or for that engine to exhaust the fuel in the fuel line, and we've rolled out of the clearing turn at that point. You're going straight ahead, and we experience a loss of thrust on the left engine. There is always 100% of the time, a shock factor that happens, because there's no red light, there's no big flag that comes up that tells you that engine has failed. You still have good manifold pressure, you still have good RPM, you still have good fuel flow. The only thing that's dropped to 0 at that point is EGT, and that's one of the smallest gauges in the travel air. So now the student has we've experienced some sort of loss of thrust. So the first step, like I said, is to take a deep breath. You don't want to pull out the wrong engine or react too quickly. The airplane is still going to fly just fine, especially if you're at cruise. You have plenty of time to react. So the memory item that the memory tool that I teach is a 6-step process. And we're going to start that process now and kind of talk through each step and then talk about what airspeeds and all that we're looking for. If you look in Chapter 12 of the Airplane Flying Handbook, around page 20 or so, it gives the specific checklist to go through that you should memorize for light twins. And of course, you're going to reference the POH of the particular airplane you're flying. But in this case, this is just a memory aid that I use, and it's a 6-step process, and it starts with, well, I'll just say the process first, and then I'll explain the steps. So it's pitch, power, drag, identify, verify, feather. Those are our 6 steps. So step 1 is pitch. And we want to use this memory aid throughout any phase of the flight in a light twin. So pitch stands for pitch for blue line. Now, if we're in cruise and we're at, let's say, 150 miles an hour, which the Travel Air being 1959 model, all the airspeeds are in miles per hour. Let's say we're at 150 miles an hour. Blue line happens to be 100 miles an hour. So pitching for blue line when you're at 150, well, we might not actually pitch for that. We're probably going to just maintain level flight and maintain aircraft control. Now, if we were taking off and we were at a high pitch attitude already and a slow airspeed and we experienced loss of thrust, pitching for blue line might be required, and we might need to push the nose forward, similar to if you were recovering from a stall. But you're going to need to pitch the nose forward and get to blue line. So mainly when I say pitch, it's going to be a forward motion. If you're not at blue line, you need to pitch forward to get there. If you're above blue line, don't pitch backwards to get towards blue line. That doesn't really make sense in this scenario. So we're at or above blue line. We're happy with that. We don't need to touch our pitch in this example. Next step is power. We're going to go full power. All our levers, so we have 6 levers in a typical light twin. We're going to move all those levers smoothly to the full forward position. So we're going to take our propeller levers to full forward. We're going to take our throttles to full forward, and we're going to take our mixtures to full forward. That's our power step. So we've covered pitch, power, drag. Drag is we're going to remove drag from the aircraft. We're going to put our hands and make sure that the gear are up and the flaps are up. Now we're in cruise, so likely both of those drag devices are already up. And in this case, we'll say that they are. So pitch, power, drag are taken care of. Now the reason that we're running pitch, power, drag in cruise, because we're running it no matter what, because this is, we want to turn this into muscle memory. We want to turn it into I hate to use the term automatic response, because we still want to always analyze the situation before we run any checklist, but we always want to have the habit pattern of pitch, power, drag. It may not always be applicable, but we still want to run it. So we've gotten pitch, power, drag taken care of. Now we're into the meat of the memory item, and that is identify, verify, feather. So by controlling the aircraft, we're going to identify the dead engine with our dead foot. If we're maintaining a heading, all of our rudder pressure is going to be on the operating engine side. So if we've lost our left engine, we're going to need a lot of right rudder, because the right engine is pulling us to the left. We're going to need a lot of right rudder, and we're not going to need any left rudder. So the thing you're going to be thinking of is, wow, my left foot isn't doing anything to hold this heading. I suspect that my left engine is dead. Now, it's very hard to tell with engine gauges if your left engine is dead. Your RPM and manifold pressure are still going to have non-zero indications. Your fuel pressure will still be good. Your oil pressure will still be good. Oil temperature, CHT. The only thing that'll be at zero is your EGT gauge, which happens to be the smallest instrument in the travel air, so it's very hard to notice. So the most obvious indicator of which engine has failed is your dead foot. So you're going to say to yourself or out loud, or don't really care, I think my left engine is dead. Now you're going to verify. So that's the identify step. Now we're to the verify step. We're going to verify by carefully selecting the suspected throttle, not the prop or the mixture, but the suspected throttle. And we're slowly going to retard that throttle back to the idle position. As you pull that throttle back, you're going to very carefully note, is this making the situation worse, or is there no change? If it is an actual dead engine, you will be able to pull that throttle all the way back to the idle position, the idle stop, and none of your control inputs would have changed. So now you've just verified that it is in fact a failed left engine. So the last step in the process is feathering the engine. So you're going to carefully, and I mean carefully, because if you pull the wrong engine, now you've feathered the operating engine and you have a failed other engine. So now you don't have any engines. So you want to be very careful here. You're going to carefully select the left feather handle in this scenario's case, and you're going to pull this back to feather fairly quickly. You don't want to do this too slowly, because we could talk about how a full feathering prop works, but this is using the RPM from the windmilling prop to actually make this process happen. So you don't want to be lazy in pulling this handle back, but you don't want to be too aggressive either. But you're going to deliberately pull that handle all the way back to the feather position, which is the full detent. And what is going to happen is you're kind of opening a valve in that propeller hub. All that oil is being pushed out by physics, because each full feathering prop has a set of flyweights on it, And as they spin at a certain RPM, they put a certain amount of force, and they're always wanting to feather. So if you remove oil pressure, that's basically keeping them unfeathered or at a high RPM. As you remove that oil pressure, those flyweights are going to pull the blades into a feathered position. The best way to explain this is imagine that you're driving down the road with your window down and you have your hand out the window. A feathered prop is having your hand out of the window parallel with the ground, and it's kind of knife edging through the air. Now, if you turn your hand perpendicular to the relative air, it creates a lot of drag and pushes your arm back to the back of the car. Everybody's done this, right? So when we're feathering a prop, we're taking it from that flat pitch to a fine pitch, and that prop begins to knife edge through the air, and the prop will actually stop spinning. So when you have a fully feathered prop, you'll be able to look out, and that propeller is not spinning. And the reason we care about that as pilots is it's not creating nearly as much drag as it was when it was windmilling.
And I was just thinking about looking out there and seeing that feathered prop. I don't know what it is, but when a prop stops, it just calls my attention to it. I just want to keep staring at it, almost in disbelief when it's stopped there and feathered.
Yeah, when we do our first engine shutdown, I always take the controls, and I tell my student that they can take out their cell phone and go ahead and take a picture of that stopped prop, because everybody wants to do it. And it's great because they're going to go back home and they'll always remember that moment, and they'll actually show people, hey, check this out, I'm flying, and that propeller is clearly not moving, and everybody gets a little excited about it.
And it's kind of surprising, but a lot of people in real situations have not followed the identify, verify steps in the fashion that you've just described. Tell us a little bit about what can happen if you get that wrong. I mean, I've read about accidents of large aircraft that have gotten this wrong.
Yeah, unfortunately, failure to follow these procedures or the procedures outlined in the POH for the specific plane you're flying can quickly lead to a VMC roll. And that is a maneuver that we actually demonstrate. We practice it several times, and you have to demonstrate proficiency at the recovery of that maneuver during the check ride. So what happens is we know what VMC is, and in the travel air, it's 85 miles an hour. And we know the assumptions, so that's the actual speed. And the assumptions were like I outlined before. You've got a windmilling prop, full power on the operating engine, gear and flaps up, most unfavorable weight, most unfavorable CG, 2 to 5 degrees of bank into the operating engine, and 0 side slip. So we meet that criteria, and we'll do this at 5,000 feet. We've got the left engine pulled back to idle, and we start to decrease airspeed. Well, the only way to do that by leaving the operating engine at full power, the only way to decrease airspeed is pulling the nose up. So it's very similar to a power on stall. And here's where we enter probably one of the most dangerous things that I do in an airplane, and that is the VMC demo. So what I want to demo in this is the very beginnings of that loss of control. So as we are meeting the VMC criteria, we pitch the aircraft up and let the airspeed decay below blue line, which is VYSE, so 100 miles an hour. As it gets slower and slower and slower, we have to increase the amount of rudder force that we're putting on. Here I use a risk management technique as an instructor and actually block some of the rudder movement, and this artificially increases VMC and makes it happen a little bit earlier, because I want this loss of directional control to happen before the aircraft stalls. The last thing I want to do as an MEI is stall a twin-engine aircraft with only one engine operating. That's a very good way to get into a really nasty spin that could very easily become unrecoverable. So I artificially block rudder movement, and we will reach a point in the travel air. Usually it's around 90 miles an hour, so slightly above published VMCA, where the aircraft begins to roll, and roll is kind of a strong term. We really just start losing the ability to hold the wings level, and as soon as you feel that as a multi-engineer a pilot, the first recovery step is to pull both power levers back to the idle position. So what you're doing there is you're removing all asymmetric thrust from the plane. So the only way to recover from a VMCA roll is what it's called in multi-engine flying. The only way to recover from that is to remove asymmetric thrust. So you reach up, you pull both power levers back to the idle position, push the nose over, so it's very similar to a stall recovery. You pitch for that blue line, you get that airspeed back up, and then you very carefully add power back in on the operating engine and recover. If those steps aren't followed, the plane will continue to roll, and you'll reach a point where, you've already lost control of the aircraft. You're not going to be able to maintain bank, and could flip the airplane over completely into an inverted position. There was recently a crash of a Beechcraft Duke, sadly, I think a couple months ago, and there's security camera footage, and you can see that the plane is kind of, it seems to be doing a textbook VMC roll, and it flips over inverted and crashes into the runway just very surprisingly quickly.
I lost friends back in 2000 in a Cessna 320. They were down in Ensenada, and I was there at the same conference. And the gentleman lost one engine essentially on downwind. And apparently he got slow on the downwind to base turn, and boom, rolled over right there, and it was over pretty quickly.
Yeah, it can happen very, very quickly. So that brings up a good point of the Cessna 300 and 400 series and the larger, probably less common Beechcraft twins like the Duke, the Queen Air, and the Twin Bonanza. Then you have the Aerostar and Navajo. I put those aircraft in really their own class. They're still technically light twins, right? They're not transport category aircraft yet, but they're about as close to transport category aircraft that you can get with piston engines. The light twins that people typically learn in are, your Aztecs, Senecas, most of the Barons, 310 Seminole, Twin Comanche, Travel Air, Apache. I think I named out most of those. Now you have the new Aerostar and Tecnam. Those are a lot less powerful or a lot less high performance twin engine aircraft. When, I find it interesting that somebody can learn in a Seminole and then go get a job flying let's say a Navajo or a 414 Cessna. An engine failure in that type of aircraft is going to be a lot more difficult to handle than the engine failures they experienced in the Seminole. So, the FAA doesn't really distinguish between those two, right? As soon as you get your multi-engine rating with me in my Travel Air, you could, legally, you could go out and, if you had all the appropriate endorsements, hop in a King Air 200 and go flying. Now, the insurance companies really come in here and supplement the rules outlined by the FAA, and they say, well, no, you're not going to fly that King Air 200 until you go to some type-specific training in a simulator or do some type-specific training in that aircraft before we'll insure you to do that. So they kind of help there. But if you find yourself getting your multi-engine rating in a very light twin, what we'll call that category of the Seminole, Senecas, that sort of deal, the very light twins, and you get the offer to go fly, a 400 series or 300 series Cessna, those two categories are a lot different. So make sure you get some type-specific training, go to a simulator, because the systems get drastically more complicated. In fact, I fly King Airs, I fly the C-130. I fly some fairly advanced aircraft, and one of the aircraft that is hardest to manage, I think, and this is just my personal opinion, is a Cessna 340. It has a lot of stuff going on in there, and I kind of feel like a one-man band when I'm flying that thing around. A King Air is honestly a little bit easier to manage than that, but these really powerful light twins can be a handful to fly, and if you have an engine failure, you need to be on top of it very, very quickly, or it's going to get out of hand and unrecoverable before you know it.
That's why twin-engine aircraft are not quite as safe as people think they would be. You'd think that, you've got two engines, it should be safer. And in fact, the safety rate really isn't any better than single engines. And I think it's for just that reason. You lose an engine and suddenly it can be extremely difficult to fly the airplane.
Yeah, absolutely. When someone comes to me wanting to purchase a multi-engine aircraft because they think it's going to be safer, we kind of have this discussion. Yeah, it's not necessarily with appropriate training and with a deliberate proficiency program in maintaining that currency in the multi-engine aircraft, they can be safer. But if you're not training to those engine failures and learning the systems and keeping proficient in all of that, then that second engine is going to take you straight to the scene of the crash. You're going to lose the engine. You're going to be behind the power curve. You're not going to be able to react quick enough, and you're going to have an accident. And unfortunately, a VMC roll is kind of like a base to final spin stall. It's almost always fatal. I only know that maybe 4 people that have survived VMC accidents, and all of them were injured pretty badly. So absolutely, they're not necessarily safer. Light twins aren't. They're not equipped with the more advanced safety systems, because people are listening to this thinking, well, the airline industry is almost all twin engine aircraft at this point, and they're incredibly safe. But it's a totally different certification process for a transport category twin engine aircraft than a light twin that weighs less than 6,000 pounds. In fact, if a light twin weighs less than 6,000 pounds, it can be certified and doesn't even have to guarantee climb capability on one engine. In fact, the Traveler is pretty easy to load to max gross, and on a hotter, high-density altitude day, it won't climb on one engine. So just because you have that 2 engines doesn't necessarily mean you can fly on one engine on these light twins. Even if you weren't loaded to max gross and you lost an engine, your ability to control the aircraft on one engine is going to be more difficult when the plane's performing better. So if you're lightly loaded on a cold day near sea level, low density altitude, now you don't have to worry about your performance. You can definitely climb away on one engine, but the plane's going to be a lot harder to control at that point. So those are just a few things to think about if you're looking to, if you think a light twin is going to be safer than a single.
I'm glad you brought up certification, because I wanted to talk a little bit about how, in fact, you can have a no climb left at all and might actually be slowly descending if you lose an engine, even after you've fully cleaned everything up in the aircraft. But I think another thing that's interesting about certification is spins. Talk about spin certification in multi-engine aircraft.
Yeah, well, you might be surprised to hear that spinning a twin is so dangerous, it's not required by the certification process, so they didn't even do it in the certification process. So most of these planes, I'm sure there have been twins that, I know that multi-engine aircraft have been put into spins, but none of the manufacturers do that on purpose, and it's not required for certification. There's a couple of skydiver videos where you can see king ears going into spins inadvertently. I know it's happened on several transport category aircraft going through developmental testing. They've been put into a spin inadvertently. And if you read any of these stories, you can see the altitude loss is just very surprising. You're talking about around 5,000 feet of altitude loss probably to recover from one of those spins.
Yeah, so basically if we spin a twin, we're test pilots.
Exactly.
Yeah, that wouldn't be any fun at all. Now, if you accidentally shut down both engines on your Traveler, how fast is that going to be coming down?
I've never tested this and really don't plan to. The descent rate with both engines windmilling, I would guess, now I do practice emergency descents, and emergency descents, both throttles back to idle, props full forward, clean configuration at around 160 miles an hour, I see 4,000 feet a minute descent. So I would say if you're trying to hold at or above blue line, you're still going to see at least 2,000 feet a minute descent with both propellers windmilling. Now, if you were to feather both propellers, that would increase it a little bit. That would definitely help your glide performance. And it might be even a little bit better than, let's say, a similar aircraft single like an A-36, because you don't have the windmilling propellers. But yeah, you it's definitely heavier, and you still have more drag with both the engine nacelles out there. So you'd be coming down pretty quickly.
Yeah, when things go bad, they certainly go bad in a hurry. Talk a little bit about the requirements for getting a multi-engine. For example, folks are used to doing written exams and all that kind of stuff. What's the case with that with multi-engine?
Yeah, so I'll go back to that 6163. You are exempt from having to take any written exam, so you don't have to re-accomplish the commercial written. There is no commercial written for a multi-engine aircraft. As long as you hold a single-engine commercial rating, all that you have to do is the required training for a sign-off, is that 3 hours of flying, and complete the practical test.
And I've noticed with a lot of local flying schools, they might have maybe one twin-engine aircraft, and then it's often down for maintenance for a month or something like that. When people ask me about multi-engine training, I'm always telling them, hey, go someplace that's focused on it and dedicated to it. So tell me a little bit about VSL and what people would expect if they were to come down and do a multi-engine rating with you.
Yeah, so I recently got out of active duty, and I was fortunate enough to already be involved somewhat in general aviation, and I reached out to some of my mentors. I know I gave you a couple of phone calls, and some other professional CFIs, because I've known for a long time this is really what I would like to do is be a professional instructor. And everyone seemed to say, hey, you need to specialize in something. And I'd already been doing a lot of multi-engine training, of course, with my C-130 background and being an instructor in the HERC. That kind of came naturally. I was already doing a lot of multi-engine training in the military. So I decided to specialize in multi-engine training, purchased the Travel Air. I was also fortunate enough to be selected as a designated pilot examiner with multi-engine privileges based on my military background, giving examinations in the military. So 100% of my focus is on multi-engine training. So I have myself as a DPE, I have other MEIs that I work with, and I have other DPEs that are able to give check rides as well. And that really keeps me busy all the time. I just got back from a flight school that has a multi-engine aircraft that is out of annual. It's down for maintenance. Their maintenance department is very busy keeping all their singles going, and that's where most of their revenue comes from single engine training. They just don't have the resources available to dedicate to getting that multi-engine aircraft back flying to service just, maybe 2 or 3 customers. So instead, they kind of subcontracted to me, and I was able to go up there and efficiently focus in on just multi-engine training and get the check ride done. But yeah, absolutely. There's 2 things that are difficult to find, it seems, and that is a multi-engine DPE that's available and a multi-engine aircraft that is insured for training and an MEI that's available to teach in that.
As we start to wrap up here, I want to go back and just touch on one thing which you mentioned people might be curious about. Tell us about what a V1 cut is.
People that have been around aviation, maybe have some airline friends, they've heard about this dreaded V1 cut, and it is definitely something that the airlines train to constantly in the simulator, but it's not something that light twins are certified for, capable of doing, and nor can it be done safely in the actual airplane. So V1 is basically a decision speed used in what I like to call balanced field length theory. So balanced field length theory is more of a transport category aircraft type of terminology. And anytime you get into an airliner, that airliner is guaranteed to be able to either accelerate, lose an engine, and stop on the runway you're taking off on, or accelerate, lose an engine, and continue flying and safely be able to climb out, or else that plane would never take off. So every time you go to an airliner, you're guaranteed that there is no point of failure if an engine fails. So that's kind of balanced field length theory in a nutshell. The worst place to lose an engine in this scenario is right at that decision speed, which we call V1. So when an airliner adds power, accelerates down the runway, when they reach V1, that's their decision speed. So if everything's copacetic and running along just fine at V1, they're going to continue and take off. 99% of the time, that is what happens. If, however, they lose an engine after V1, they're still going to go flying. They're going to take off with one engine, and they're going to take that dead engine airborne, and they're going to come back around and land. If, however, an engine failure happens right before V1, they have the ability to stop in the runway remaining. So after V1, you're committed. Every airliner will announce V1 during the takeoff roll. At that point, even if they're on the ground and lose an engine, they're still going flying. Before V1, you're going to stop on the runway remaining. So, of course, being a good examiner, every examiner in the simulator, because all this is done in the simulator, will make that engine failure happen right at V1, or maybe just slightly after V1. And that is the most difficult situation because you're kind of right there, have to make the decision. So that's a V1 cut. And that is a very common training tool that's used in the airlines. The reason they do it in the simulator, of course, is if you actually do it on the runway, there's very little room for error. You're moving well over 100 miles an hour at that point. So it's not something you'd want to train on in the aircraft. In my travel air, there really is no such thing as V1. In the travel air, if I lose an engine and I'm below 500 feet, I've already made the decision that I'm going to treat it like a single engine failure. So as if I was taking off in a Bonanza and lost an engine, I'm not giving myself the choice to try to climb away because there's too many accidents of low altitude engine failures where people don't react in time or they react incorrectly and they VMC roll. So I've already made the decision at ground speed 0 that if I lose an engine at any point below 500 feet AGL, I'm going to close both throttles and find a good place to make a forced landing 20 degrees left or right of the nose. Now, above 500 feet, that's when I'm going to attempt to do my pitch, power, drag, identify, verify, feather, and climb away and try to make it to a better landing location.
Well, Seth, for people who are interested in getting a multi-engine rating, where do they go to find out more information about VSL Aviation and to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so you could go to my website, vsl.aero. You can look me up on Google or Facebook there as well. I'd be happy to talk to anyone. I'm not a very big flight school. Don't have a ton of capacity yet, just getting started. But my program typically takes 3, maybe 4 days, depending on weather, and I think has competitive rates. Also, I like to pride myself on being a professional instructor with a lot of real-world experience. So I'm not a 500-hour CFI building time. Nothing against 500-hour CFI's building time, but I like to incorporate a lot of real-world lessons learned into my training.
Seth, thanks so much for coming on the show today. This has been really informative, and I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people understand how to become a safe multi-engine pilot.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I really appreciate you having me on, and as always, just enjoy the show.
Well, my thanks to Seth for coming on the show and sharing some of his deep knowledge on multi-engine aircraft flying. If you want to read more about Seth and getting a multi-engine rating at his flight school in Arkansas, VSL Aviation, check out his website at vsl.aero, and I'll have a link to his website in our show notes. Now, to get to the show notes in the Apple Podcast app or in our dedicated Aviation News Talk apps for iOS and Android, just swipe up on your phone while you're listening to this show. Or on the web, go to aviationnewstalk.com, and that's the same place to go to send me an email with any feedback or to record a listener question you'd like answered on a later show. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact or on Listener Question at the top of the page. And please don't forget to tell your friends about this show because that's how we get most of our new listeners. When people like you tell a friend about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, and yes, hard to believe, a lot of people still don't, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk apps for iOS and Android. In the App Store, have them search for Aviation News Talk. And yes, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.